It is a splendid irony that the smallest of the foreign races contains the most mystery. Peerless in understanding and wielding of the arcane, the Gnomes are beings without true physical form due to events on their home world. Meticulous and easily absorbed in the many tasks aboard their floating city ship Skyhold, diligence and service tend to be the highest gnome virtues, along with sound innovation. Expansion is not a cultural aim, and the Gnomes have no real enemies. But some do long to face the perils and prizes of Terminus. This rare planet, known as a sun world, formed from the inside out. Her very mass was grafted together in a sphere around a thimble of a star named Elos, like a pearl gathering an oyster over itself. Though a handful of colder, distant stars shined upon Stormona, its outer crust endured a shadowy veil of dimness, like a forgotten bride. For centuries, the Gnomes toiled under the constant dusk of the far stars, surviving not by individual might, but a collective inertia that conquered challenges of every scale. Yet an ancient myth persisted amongst the race. It spoke of a moment occurring but once a generation, when the far stars would abandon Stormona briefly, and true night would fall upon their lands. In that sudden darkness, up through the very ground would whisper faint hues of light, the call of Elos, the one near star. A splinter of the native Gnomes held on to the myth as truth, and on the long-awaited twilight they entered fissures in the metallic soil of the crust. Here they beheld the refracted flickers of radiant light coming from deep beneath the surface of their dim planet. This discovery touched off the first rift in Gnomen history, of which there are two. For by the time the travelers returned, the dusk light of the far stars had as well. The eldership of the Gnomes was sundered over their account of Elos's existence. This discord was evidenced by a single bright stone, brought from the depths and presented to the council. For half of their number, the stone was rebuked as ordinary and dead. For the remainder, however, it was hailed as glowing and alive, albeit faintly. Thus, when for the first time in its history the eldership could reach no accord, it was disbanded, permitting the growing number of Gnomes to return to the search for Elos. Shortly after launch, the hopeful exploration was mired in tragedy, as the Gnomes learned they could venture but only so far towards Elos at a time. Their eyes were untrained for such light, which grew stronger as they neared and burned many blind at first. Their skin, too dense from the cold of the outer surface, left their bodies faint from the heat of Elos's rays. Thus, it was a patient descent, stretched over many generations, that brought the Gnomes to the door of the near star at last. When their elderhood finally permitted breaking through the inner crust, there drew a sight beyond imagination. Settled in an open expanse was the majestic Elos, with small planets orbiting about in undisturbed choreography. The walls of this cavernous sphere were lined with a glowing mineral new to the Gnomes, which they learned held the power of Elos's fire. This mineral they named Reservoir, for it held deposits of arcane energy which could be drawn back out and into the very body of a gnome. The powers and ability it granted were far beyond any warrior or mage. These wielders of Elos's fire became known as the Arcanos. Yet this otherworldly paradise, which ought have been beyond blemish, ushered in the second rift amongst the gnomes. All too quickly, the powers of Elos's fire were sought in gluttonous measure by the Arcanos, their personal cravings overtaking a discernment for all gnomes. Foreseeing disaster, a splinter of the gnomes petitioned the Elderhood to restrict the use of Elos's fire, pleading that the gnomes retreat for a brief time outside the inner crust. These were called the Profane by the Arcanos hierarchy, a name concocted from accusation and mockery. Though the Profane spoke with earnest fear for their brothers and sisters, the allure of the Arcanos crushed their justified concerns. The Profane were exiled into a floating prison known as the Skyhold, fated to circle Elos till she consumed them. This airborne expanse was built of spent reservoir, though the Arcanos critically misunderstood that reservoir could be infused anew. For years, the Profane painstakingly extracted the resource, constructing a pillar within the heart of the Skyhold of pure reservoir. Therein they stored a measure of Elos's fire. Yet as they labored in secret, the Arcanos worked ever more madly to draw ethereal power from the star. To this end, they constructed spires of pure reservoir, aiming the immense towers directly at Elos, sapping power beyond the natural limits the star freely gave. For gazing too long, we lost the ability to see. For taking too much, we lost the ability to feel. These grave indiscretions transfigured us into gossamer wisp things. I saw their faces as they perished, which were gleeful and serene. And were it not my lot to be woken, I too would have faded in a furious bliss and vanished. The gorge of her energy began to weaken Elos, loosing the bonds of her power in devastating surges. As her unbridled rays struck the inner crust, many of the gnomes were consumed, yet the Skyhold, built to lock the Profane away until death, bore well against the lashes of Elos for a time. When a giant hole was struck straight through the crusts of Stormona, the exiled gnomes piloted the structure through it, escaping to the quiet atmosphere of their ancestors. Yet survival had not been perfect. As the bristling energy in the reservoir continued to sift through the Skyhold, a dire conclusion was reached by the gnomes. They must abandon their mortal flesh or perish. With the very power that was afflicting our bodies, we were able to repossess our souls into the reservoir cloth called Makesh. This garment, wove from the hallowed mineral, was meant to further our survival as we drew nearer to Elos, though we knew it could not preserve us against her final embrace. When deposited on Terminus, the Skyhold floated undisturbed above White Thor for nearly 50 years. A deep, resonant hum slowly bore an inverted cone in the snow directly underneath the hulk. Otherwise, the ship roosted in the skies with silent unconcern. It stands as the capital city of the gnomes, striking in its inorganic majesty, begging more questions than the race cares to answer. Terminus has brought a return to the unified workman traits of their ancient brothers and sisters. And the gnomes may not have been so at peace in all their existence.